With the changing times in the action figure collecting hobby, it seems like more and more people of that community are starting to turn their gaze towards overseas companies such as Fondjoy here to deliver on some of the much more higher caliber and much more quality figures for practically the same price. So color me intrigued when Fondjoy decided to announce their own take on the Corn Sweat James Gunn 2025 Superman, and I was most definitely intrigued considering that their batting average is more or less successful in my eyes as the occurrences that I've covered Fondjoy on the channel. It's been to varying degrees of quality, and there's been one slight dud in the form of that Pattinson Batman, to be quite honest, but at least in regards to their Ben Affleck Batman that I've covered in both the BVS portrayal and the Justice League version, I think that they were doing a remarkable job of capturing the likeness and the details of that particular Dark Knight in, I don't want to say 1/12 scale because they opted in for a much more unique scale in the form of a 1/9 figure. And it looks like they're doing a similar thing here with the Corn Sweat Superman, only this time they were making some headlines when they released the photos, and I wasn't necessarily impressed, but I was still kind of holding out for them to potentially make a form of splash, a little bit of a ripple in the pool that is every single company out there bringing about their own Corn Sweat James Gunn Superman, and yet for some strange reason not being able to lock it down in terms of likeness. So I finally was able to procure my own unit here thanks to Calkeys.com. If you guys want to check out their site, I'm going to be putting their links in the description as well as a pinned comment. They got their website pulled up right there with pre-orders for other Fondjoy figures, including the Lex Luthor. But now fully in stock is the Fondjoy Corn Sweat James Gunn Superman, so you guys can get it over there and import it directly. Competitive pricing, nice shipping, really well kind of brought in, very secure in package, and I cannot really complain. So shout out to Calkeys for providing this figure for review, but just know that my opinions on the figure are going to be directed towards Fondjoy specifically and are going to be of my own. So just know that I'm going to be very straightforward in regards to what they were able to generate here in, like I said, the 1/9 scale figure. It definitely stands a little taller than your traditional 6 or even 7-inch figure, but at the same time, I do feel like they managed to capture a little bit of that accurate height and even proportion to the Corn Sweat build that he got going on with this specific version of the suit, because something that we kind of were able to kind of take away from the design of the suit, even from those initial onset photos, was that they were going to go for a much bulkier design to not just the physique of Superman, kind of designed to be a bit more brawn-like as opposed to being super cut up and muscular with like the muscle fibers not being able to kind of come through the suit in and of itself and feel very skin tight. Here we went with a much more uniform looking suit, complete with a little bit of extra padding and bagginess, and Fondjoy was able to nail that look even with a slightly much more accurate color scheming, because you'll notice that the blue is a bit more tilting more so towards the baby blue distinction as opposed to something a bit more saturated, something a bit more bold. And a similar thing could be said about the red. Granted, I do kind of wish that the red was a little less opaque because it does come off just a little washy in regards to practically any part of the figure that is red, whether it be the cape, the underoos, even a little bit of the S design instead of the chest emblem, and even down to the boots as far as the specific color hue. But in terms of uniformity, it works really well, even down to the belt with the yellow there and the symbol background as far as the shield. The yellow and the blue and the red capture very nice, garners your eye. And taking a closer look at some of the texture work and the sculpting for the figure itself, like I mentioned before, they captured a little bit of the extra bagginess that the suit was known for in camera, but at the same time still not sacrificing any of that extra musculature that Corn Sweat was able to bulk up for the role. So you could see an awful lot of that happening alongside the chest. Like I mentioned before, he's a little bit more brawn in terms of his width, but at the same time they made sure to capture the proportions for the most part pretty accurately. There's a very specific reason as to why I'm saying most part, because as far as practically everything from the neck down, in my opinion, is done very, very nicely. As far as the length of his legs, the arms, the way that the sculpt is, like I said, very proportional, as well as the texture work for some of the linings of the suit that I know, depending on subjective tastes, it really depends on whether you like the lines that are kind of protruding from the side right here to kind of make it look like some kind of alien-like suit, but to me it sort of works. If any nitpicks I could come up with, it would say that maybe in the process of generating some of the lining that you see here on the side, and then underneath sculpting the little pattern, the little kind of cross pattern that he's got going on the surface of the plastic for both the blue and the red. Some of the lines do have a little bit of a 3D printed effect in terms of how it feels to the finger touch, but at the same time, it feels very robust and solid. And in my opinion, when we kind of start to change up a little bit of the texture work, I do appreciate that the underpants have this kind of like rubberized effect that at least feels different to the rest of the plastic that's utilized for the main body. You have the boots that have a much more lacier, I want to say almost semi-glossy finish to the surface of the boots to be a bit more accurate, while at the same time not sacrificing any of the lines that you see right there on the side of the shoes or even at the top of the boot. And then when we kind of navigate upwards, you see a little bit more of the lines that make up the sleeves, the forearms, a little bit of that kind of elongated effect along the cuffs that kind of cover up just barely the bottom part of the palm right there, or the hand rather, the top of the hand. And then as you navigate towards the center of the chest emblem here, I do appreciate that the chest symbol is sculpted as opposed to just being painted on, so it feels very nice in hand. I do kind of wish that maybe a little bit of refinement would have been taken into consideration with the paint applications of the red and the yellow, because if you look a little closely, there is a slight little QC problem. You see a little bit of fading and a little bit of flakiness to some of the bits of the red here towards the bottom. I do see a little red speck there in the yellow where it's not supposed to be. And I do think that a little bit of the yellow on the outer rims is starting to trail off into the blue of the top part of his suit, just underneath the collar. So that's just a little bit of a bummer. But one little bright side is considering that this is not simply just a screen application or simply just a paint app. It's naturally sculpted into the chest part of his plastic, which is more than what I can say for the back symbol. I guess we're going to be able to segue a little easier here into the cape, because as you'll note right there, I was tremendously disappointed to learn that they simply incorporated a yellow symbol on the back of the cape here via, I believe the term is called dye sublimation. I could be wrong. I could be getting my methods here completely misnamed, but it's either dye sublimation or digital printing, whatever the case may be. But basically, the symbol is part of the fabric as opposed to being grafted on via some kind of like patch or skin graft. Or skin graft. That makes it sound much more morbid and much darker than initially intended. But it's part of the fabric. It's actually dyed in there. So you'll notice right there that it's pretty... I hate to say this because it's going to sound a little mean, but it's almost like a glorified JPEG, and it's simply just got inked inside of the fabric as opposed to just being an actual piece that you can kind of feel, which is a shame because we have companies here in the States for about the same price that went a little above and beyond for the yellow symbol here on the back. So it would have been nice if maybe Fondjoy implemented those same methods as opposed to just doing what it is that they did right here. But on the bright side, you can see right here that the cape itself, I cannot necessarily complain too much about because it's nicely tailored. It is a little on the wrinkled side, but of course that's something that I can definitely fix via some simple ironing or straightening. You have this tailoring that is meant to be just a little bit on the extra longer side to make sure that it's draping here towards the bottom, because that's naturally how it did in the movie. It didn't have any of those cut-off points to where it just kind of cuts off halfway through the boot. And as kind of per the other Fondjoy figures, predominantly Batmans that they've had in the past, they did incorporate a wire into the outer rims of the capes right here that is not necessarily the firmest. It doesn't feel terribly hard in hand, but it definitely retains shape. So it's one of those nice microfiber sort of wires that, again, doesn't feel terribly rigid or firm, but when you do give it a form of pose or some kind of stance and you kind of futz and mess with it, it definitely retains its shape. So if you ever want to coil it in a very flight-based position, you could do so with absolutely no problem, as you can kind of see before you right there. And it definitely complements the cape in a way that doesn't feel like it's compromising or tattering it in any sort of way, which is good to hear, considering that if you look a little bit towards the top right here, I do kind of wish that the stitching, because overall the stitching for the cape is very nicely, especially the way that they wrapped it around the wire on the outermost parts and even down towards the bottom trimming here. But when it comes to the part that's kind of wrapped around the collar, at least the back of the collar right here, you'll notice that it's a little tattered. It's got like that really quick, cut or snap cut sort of design to the innerwards part. I kind of wish that was tailored just a little bit better, or at least looked a little bit more refined, because I really dig how they folded it into his shoulder pieces right there. It's much better than the competitor, which we'll showcase later during the comparison part of the review. But I do kind of wish that that was tailored just a little bit nicely. It just looked a little more refined and not so slapdash. And while we're at the top right here, let's comment on arguably the most controversial part of not just this Superman figure, but practically any that comes from any toy company that exists these days that tackle this specific license. And that's got to be the corn sweat likeness to Superman. A point of contention for various companies that are just simply fumbling the ball, and Fondjoy almost found themselves grouped in with the rest of those controversial portrayals, because up until this point, before getting this guy in hand, I thought that McFarlane was quite literally the best likeness to Corn Sweat Superman that there was, at least at the affordable price. Obviously, if money's no object, you could probably consider the InArt in there, and even he's not 100% accurate, and then probably right after that in third place would be the Hot Toys. But I personally feel like there's a little bit of offness to a bit of the brow area, and that, again, going back to InArt, I do think that he's a little bit too brawny looking, a little too wide in the shape of his face. But lo and behold, it looks like an awful lot of that scrutiny was heard by the folks over at Fondjoy, and just in the nick of time, I don't know if it was during the time that those promo photos were released or just shortly thereafter, they were able to fix the head sculpt, which quite honestly does rival that of other companies, including McFarlane's, because I feel like in this scale, whether it be 6-inch, 7-inch, or in this case 8.5-ish inch, maybe 9-inch, this is probably one of the more favorable portrayals of the Corn Sweat likeness. It's still not perfect. I personally feel like a little bit of the dilation in his pupils look a little too freaky for my taste, but at least they managed to capture the wider jaw, the dimples inside of the cheeks, and the overall composition of his face a little bit more favorably than that of goddamn Ace H Figure Arts, who decided to give us super Shooter McGavin than anything else. That combined with the slicked back look to the hair, which is sculpted very nicely, although I personally would have liked a little bit of that curl to be sculpted there on the side. Even McFarlane was able to nail that. But again, the skin tone, the eyebrows, everything else, down to even a little bit of a cool technique utilized for the ears to make it look like they're kind of flesh tone, combined with, I don't know if it comes across well on camera or if I'll have to demonstrate this via B-roll, but you can see like they managed to thin out a little bit of the plastic towards the edge of the ears, almost similar to how real life ear cartilage works, when you have like a light behind the ears and you can actually see the light sort of beaming through your ears, and it kind of gets a little denser as you get closer to the inside part of your skull. They did a little bit of that happening with the ears, so that is a very fine touch. It's almost good enough for me to forgive. In my opinion, I don't know if any of you feel the same way, but I do personally feel like the neck is a little too long. It's one of the things that did stand out to me when I pulled him out of the box, was that the neck was just a little bit too tall for my taste, that I kind of wish that he was stumping down just a little bit. I'm able to hide it a little bit, especially when you get into some of the poses and some of the inclinations you could put the head in, when we'll tackle the articulation here momentarily, but a little bit of the protrusion of the neck could have been a bit more refined, which is a shame because the skin tone is done really well as far as the shadowing of the Adam's apple right there, and overall, like I said, the paint applications to make the skin almost look a little lifelike. But when it comes to actually moving the head about, which I guess brings us to the articulation, there's a couple of little criticisms that come to mind. One of them would have to be that even though the head is able to very naturally move 360 degrees no problem, as well as tilt up and down, as you can kind of see right there, side to side no problem, it is a little bit on the loose side. You can see right there that a simple little flick and the head moves no problem. I kind of wish that maybe the joint inside, whether it be a dumbbell or a ball joint, was sculpted just a little bit bigger to give it a little bit of added snug to make sure that it holds tightly. Pressing the head down gives it a little bit more snug, but not as much as you would like. And obviously when you move the head about, it's going to cancel it out. And then when it comes to the neck joint in and of itself, can also technically move. You can get a little bit of added tilting towards the bottom, especially because of the way that the collar is designed to give a little bit more waves here towards the front. You can move the head downwards like so, but you can hear a little bit of squeaking, and that's because despite being able to bend the head downwards more so like that due to that articulation, it doesn't do much else for any other direction. Tilting upwards, the neck doesn't move any further. Tilting side to side, it can kind of nudge ever so slightly, but not much more than that. So kind of wish that they would have taken a much more figure arts or Mafix approach to that neck joint right there. As far as the arms, you can definitely move them vertically 360, no problem, as you can kind of find it right about right there, as well as a good, nice extension off towards the sides via a hinge found inside, and even a slight little shrugging motion. You can kind of see right there that the the shoulder is shifting upwards and downwards ever so slightly. There's no butterfly movement that I can really find, but there's a little bit of shrugging to allow further extension towards the top, like so, a little bit above the shoulder length. And then we get to the biceps, which has caused a little bit of a controversy amongst toy community, specifically on the subreddits for both Fondjoy and action figures, because I have in fact seen a handful of horror stories, horror stories with this guy in regards to not necessarily both biceps, but just the left bicep, because a lot of collectors are breaking their left biceps. A lot of people have come forward with testimonies saying that Fondjoy didn't sculpt out or assemble the left bicep joint accurately to the point where it just breaks almost each and every single time. I gotta be honest, I've had this figure now for about a week. Been playing with them, been futzing with that bicep joint, and I haven't had any problems. It's able to rotate the bicep joint the full 360, no problem on both arms. So far, haven't had any problems that I could speak of, but we'll definitely keep you guys updated should that change. Both elbow joints can bend upwards, though a little bit limited on one of them. I don't know if I attribute that to the sculpting of the bicep or whatnot, but it can almost bend the arms almost all the way up, but they kind of stop just a little bit shorter than I would have liked them to be. You do have a ball joint inside of the wrist that can fully rotate the hand in place 360, as well as slightly bend inwards and outwards. I kind of wish it could go a little further, which technically you can if you get the hinge in a direction that favors it because of the way that the cuff is designed. So you're going to have to kind of move it out of the way like so. Then we get to the torso. That's a little bit conflicting because you do get a mid-torso cut that can only slightly nudge side to side. You can kind of see it right there, slightly moving. But because of the way that it's sculpted, it stops just shy at about right there before it conflicts with the ab piece. So you'll notice right there it starts to squeak a little bit. But when it comes to extension towards the back, slightly nudges, but can definitely crunch via a shifting motion right about right there. So definitely a good amount of crunching found on the upper torso joint. And then if you want to go a little further, the waist joint can definitely crunch and extend towards the back and towards the front much more favorably. Nice crunching on the oblique side to side on the waist as well. And if you're looking for full 360 rotation, the waist is definitely able to accommodate. Top legs are a little bit restricted. You'll notice right there that moving the top legs towards the front there, they can stop right about right there, but they start to revert back to motion via the diaper piece right there. It kind of pushes them down slightly, so that's a slight little discrepancy. Extension towards the back, like so, a little bit of a gap there, but you can kind of go as far as that. And then extension towards the sides is actually not too bad, though it does create a little bit of a creasing motion there in the diaper piece, like so. Two knee joints that can bend almost all the way up, but similar to the elbows, they come just a little bit short. Again, I don't know if it's the placement of the knee joints or the bulkiness of the thigh, but you can see that that's as far as you get. And then ankle joints are a little curious because they're kind of dumbbell designed, so you are able to bend them down, but you kind of have to give them a little bit of an extra shift towards the front to kind of... It's difficult to articulate on camera, but just trust me when I say that you have to futz and shift them slightly to bend them down almost all the way down like so, and then tilt them upwards like so, right about right there. They can fully rotate the full 360, but just mind a little bit of the design towards the bottom part of the boot right here that's kind of covering up the sides of the ankles. And then you can even incline them inwards and outwards like so via that dumbbell design. Just be careful, but they could be found right there. So it's a unique ankle joint that I do appreciate, and I do hope that Fondjoy keeps around. And then towards the front right there, you'll obviously notice the toe articulation that can fully bend all the way up like so. So minus a couple of those discrepancies I mentioned with the legitimate joints, as well as maybe needing a slightly much more stronger wire for the cape, you could see that articulation and posability is still going to be probably one of the highlights for the Superman figure, especially since you're dealing with a character that requires an awful lot of maneuverability and naturally is going to want to be posed in a sort of flight-based maneuver or stance. And one of the things to kind of favor that would also have to be the hands that are also included via the standard edition. I need to put emphasis on that because there's technically two versions of this figure. And in the standard edition, you get these included pair of hands, of which are also symmetrical. You don't compromise one pose having to be leaning in one direction or one orientation versus the other. He's ambidextrous in this case because naturally he's got the two fists that you've already kind of seen there via the skin tone paint applications similar to that of his face, so they blended very nicely. But you also get included these semi-gripping, semi-relaxed hands, so you can kind of maybe attribute them as being sort of relaxed, or maybe you could make him look like he's holding onto his hip, be a very hopeful design, very similar to this right here. You get that option there, and then, much like with other companies, you're also going to have your flight-based hands. Although, Fondjoy opted for something a little bit more unique, because when I think of flight hands for a Superman figure, whether it be Corn Sweat here or any other interpretation, you typically think of like flat with the thumb resting by the side. So, color me curious when I noted that Fondjoy opted for a much more unique orientation with his hands, where you got the fingers extended towards the front, but then you have the thumb curled up on the inside part of the palm there. So this is my first time ever seeing a gesture like this for a Superman figure. I don't know exactly what the explanation behind this is, but you get a much more unique interpretation of the flight pose for Superman, and I can't for the life of me remember if he did this specific gesture with his hands during flight in the movie, so I'm gonna have to probably rewind. Hey, look at that! I have an excuse to watch the movie again to see if exactly this is what he did. And the only other thing included in the standard edition is gonna be the traditional Fondjoy base, which is of course sculpted in this oval design and comes with the trademark very robust articulated arm here with included spring-loaded mechanism for the grip here at the top. And much like I mentioned before, do be careful with that arm because it's very rigid, very robust, to the point where I'm not going to say it's brittle, but just make sure that you're holding it very firmly because it's very easy to break should you bend it in the wrong direction or the wrong pose. But it's one of the few arms that I'm supremely glad gets included with a Superman figure because it's definitely going to be favoring an awful lot of flight poses and hold them very tightly in that pose, especially with that spring-loaded mechanism embedded into the grips right here that can hold it in mid-air flight sort of stance with no problem. As far as the base is concerned, I really do appreciate that Fondjoy opted in for a Fortress of Solitude themed blue tint, as opposed to your traditional black bases included with some of their Batman figures. Though my nitpicks that I've had before with some of the alignment of the logo on top are still carried on over here, I still feel like the logo is just like a millimeter off center. I don't know if it's just my eyes or something, but I just feel like the logo could have been a bit more centralized. But kudos to the Superman nameplate there because I do feel like the name is a bit more lined up versus the plastic as opposed to prior Batman bases that I've dealt with in the past. And that's pretty much everything included in the standard edition. Already pretty much a good value for roughly somewhere between 35 to 40 bucks MSRP, of course, if you don't factor in shipping. If you do, you're probably ballooning it up to slightly 50 bucks, and that's still a compelling argument. But I also managed to procure the deluxe edition because naturally that's what I do. And in the deluxe edition, jumping up to somewhere roughly between $60 to $70 with shipping and taxes all included, you also get the good boy himself, Crypto. 2 Cryptos, which is already a bewildering choice that Fondjoy opted to make, something that I've already kind of mentioned a couple of times in streams in terms of my personal takes as to why it is that they made this choice, even from when the official promo photos were first revealed. Because to this day, I still don't understand for why either Fondjoy or any company is opting in to include Cryptos with their Superman figures and not articulating them, because you get not 1 but 2 Cryptos, and sure, the paint applications for the fur as well as the sculpt work that manages to kind of bring about the fur, bring about the tail, the paws, the anatomy of the doggo himself is done pretty nicely. And one of the things that I really do appreciate about these two is able to differentiate the sculpt work happening on the cape in and of itself. I do appreciate that the cape is naturally draping very genuinely to the sides of the body for the doggo here, as opposed to the flight version that is actually kind of waving it mid-air in this pose right here. And it's made out of a rubberized plastic that feels pretty good in hand, while at the same time not compromising any of the rigidness to it and making sure that I don't have any fears of it breaking. But two things. One is that I still don't understand why they couldn't just give us one crypto, but make them articulated. And I'm not asking for anything crazy. Simply just articulate all four arms right here. It doesn't have to have any included elbow joints or paw joints. Just articulate the arms, maybe the tail right here to make it look like he's wagging the tail, and call it a day. That's pretty much it. But they opted to instead give us neutral statuettes, little mini figurines of crypto, one in a neutral pose that you can see right here is able to stand on all fours, or one that is then oriented to make him look like he's mid-flight, which again, I appreciate the anatomy of the body to make it look very natural to that of a doggo taking flight, the actual sculpt work for the cape making it look like it's mid-flight. But the other thing that also noted is that the paint application, it's almost like a running thing happening with these Fondjoy figures, that they can't get their yellow symbols correct. Because on the neutral stance crypto, you'll notice that the symbol is painted on very accurately, looks very high def, if you will, in terms of the orientation and the actual resolution printed on top of the plastic. But when it comes to the flight crypto, you'll notice that I don't know if it was meant to be a creative choice, but it looks very smudged up. And I don't know if maybe that was their way to make it look like maybe it's blurry because it's mid-flight. He's going so fast, super doggo, that it's just going crazy. But I would have liked it if it was put on there just a little bit more neatly, because again, it's reminding me of the yellow symbol that's actually on Soups, done in a slightly slapdash job. So that would have been a little bit better refined. But frankly, that pales in comparison to probably the biggest problem with not just this crypto, but frankly, both cryptos included here. Because notice that I didn't talk about the biggest factor of these crypto figures, which has to be the head sculpt, which I would have benefited from some sort of head articulation, because I really do appreciate that not just Fondjoy, but all these companies are being very cohesive with the most iconic personality trait that crypto is known for, which is to have one ear flopped down and then one perked up. It's kind of synonymous with his personality, how rambunctious he is, etc. So I like that Fondjoy, McFarlane, even Hot Toys and InArt are incorporating that into their crypto figurines. And again, the sculpt work behind the fur on the rest of the body is carried on over to the head, as well as a nice little paint application for the collar and even the yellow symbol there on the front. But my God, what the hell did they do to my boy? Look how they massacred my boy with those eyes. Jesus Christ, he looks demented. I appreciate that you guys refined the corn sweat look here as far as the likeness right before the release of the damn thing. But you guys couldn't have taken like an extra day or so to make sure that the pupils on my boy Crypto here are at least looking forward. Because if anything, the eyes to Crypto here are reminding me of that dog that was like super trained to not eat the cupcake, and they did like an expose on him. And the video, as soon as that video hit the internet, it went viral because it showed the dog being told to not eat the cupcake, and he just goes into like a trance. His eyes are just going blank with not a single brain cell working in that brain of his, and it's almost damn near scary. And that's pretty much what these little crypto figures are reminding me of. And it's so demented looking that not even the little bit of a consolation prize that they incorporated into the figure is able to distract me from those eyes. That consolation prize is the only form of articulation found on not just one crypto, but both. They actually threw in an articulated mouth. Yes, you can actually open the mouth on both crypto figures, which, credit where credit is due. I believe that's probably more so than what any other toy company, including some of the more, prolific, high-tier caliber companies like InArt and Hot Toys are willing to do with their crypto figures. Those figures, they're going to come with like articulated wired capes and whatnot, but none of them have been able to give us openable mouths for their cryptos. And Fondjoy was able to break the ground there. I just wish that they could have broken the ground as far as actually articulating the rest of the body. That still remained to be seen. I don't know if like a third party is going to give us a good crypto with articulated arms, or if we're going to have to resort to some customizer on Etsy, etc., whatnot, to give us a legitimate crypto. Hopefully one with much more lifelike eyes, because again, despite giving us this articulated mouth, those eyes, man, they're not doing crypto any favors here, whether it be the neutral one or even the flight one, which also came with a complementary base that you're able to fit on the abdomen via this peg right here. So you're able to pose it next to Soups to make it look like they're both flying together. And again, I appreciate the included little value here for the deluxe edition with 2 cryptos, but I would have definitely taken simply just 1 crypto, articulating him, and calling it at that. And if that wasn't weird enough, they included just one last thing with the deluxe edition, something that you really wouldn't have expected with a action figure of this size. Maybe Hot Toys, maybe InArt, because I know that sometimes they throw in little tchotchkes, little complimentary items that are just there to kind of sweeten the deal, but sometimes you also kind of wonder, is this really needed, or is this just inflating the price? But here, it's just strange. I just thought it was peculiar to include, but nevertheless showcased in the review. And that's going to be a Daily Planet press badge, life size. So obviously this is meant to just be kind of decorative, and it's made out of this kind of, construction paper sort of plastic, something that you typically find in like Staples or whatnot. So there's not much more that I could really mention as far as the quality of the plastic. Would have been nice if it was maybe laminated ahead of time. You could definitely do so. You could take it to your local office space, if they're even still around, or Staples, to get it laminated. But as far as what's included on the actual printing of the badge itself, you'll notice it says right there, Daily Planet Press. You have the Daily Planet logo, kind of a watermark, so to speak, in the background there. You also get some notable details that, again, kind of puzzle me, because on the back it just says Daily Planet logo there, the watermark. You even have a cutout right there for the perforation in case you ever want to strap it onto a lanyard of some kind. But then on the bottom there, you have 42 Concord Street, Metropolis, the address for the office. Personally, I would move, because I wouldn't want to live anywhere that's named Concord, because pretty much anything named Concord has a bit of a rough past and a very detrimental future, if you know what I mean. But to me, like I said, the more puzzling thing would have to be the details on the front, because you'll notice that this is Clark Kent's badge. You have his name, his position, his division, international politics, once again the address, and here his class and organization, which is kind of redundant considering we already know some of that information beforehand. But then you'll notice you have this empty square here. So my guess is like, okay, the empty square is supposed to incentivize collectors to maybe cut out their own little profile pic and apply it there. But then why would you put Clark Kent's name there and his information, his position and whatnot? Either leave this open for us to fill in ourselves to make it look like we have our own personalized daily press badge, or include his picture, which I'm guessing you weren't able to do because you weren't able to secure rights on an actual photo of David Cornsweet. Just saying. So yeah, some conflicting natures behind this extra little doodad, but it is a doodad nonetheless that's probably not going to be seen after I put it away after filming this review. So since we pretty much wrapped up on what's included inside of the deluxe edition, the only thing really left to do inside of this video would be to compare it to its only direct competitor as far as what could be acquired within this range of not only sizing, scale, articulation, price range, but frankly what's available right now if you're not opting to buy something for your child in the form of a Spin Master $10 buck. So here, within the $35, maybe even $40 after some shipping and handling, depending on where you pick them up from. On the far right, you have the McFarlane Toys Deluxe Edition, because I feel like that's probably the most direct one to pull out from. Not the standard single release that's available in wide retailers, or even the gold label Battle Damage exclusive to Targets. No. The deluxe edition, because he's got the cloth cape, he's got the bonuses, and granted, they're not going to be scaling at the most accurate level. As you can kind of see right here, McFarlane is always opting in for the 7-inch format, whereas Fondjoy, being the 1/9 scale, like I mentioned before, is practically going for the 8 to 8.5 inches, so it's naturally towering over that of the McFarlane. And the other much more apparent thing that you're going to be able to pick up right from the bat is going to be the color scheming, where looking at the Fondjoy in isolation, I think to myself, yeah, the blue really pops. The yellow accents on the belt as well as behind the symbol are really saturated and kind of capture your eye. But one of my earlier nitpicks was that the red is just coming across just a tad bit opaque for my liking. But at the same time, I feel like now looking at him next to the McFarlane, I feel like here they strived for a bit more accuracy. Though my personal tastes do kind of appreciate the red that was put on the McFarlane, especially with the specific hue they utilized for the cape, the undergarments, the underoos, and then most definitely the much darker hot rod red that they used inside of the chest emblem itself. But I am self-aware that between the two, this one's striving to go for the much more color accurate or screen accurate hue of the red on the overall ensemble, specifically the cape, and it does naturally fit more. So I at this point it really depends on subjectivity of which one you gravitate towards it, and looking at them much more directly one to one. Like I said, this one goes for a much more darker, muted down approach. I don't know if it's maybe because of the specific pigmentations they utilize when applying paint applications in the factory over there at McFarlane or whatever factory they use over in China. But I do feel like it kind of reminds me more so of Superman Returns outfit rather than anything else, rather than the current James Gunn Corn sweatsuit. So at that point, it really depends if you want to go for something that just speaks to you in terms of color preference or if you're going for screen accuracy. And if you are going for accuracy, you're probably betting on the Fondjoy a little bit more favorably. When it comes to the sculpting, though, I think here's where I'm able to become just a little bit more objective and say that, yeah, I'm going to have to give it over to the Fondjoy because with a slightly bigger canvas, you're dealing with much more accurate proportions. The overall, and sure, like I said, it's towering a little bit. You could say that maybe they're elongating the legs a little bit, but have you seen David Cornsweet? The dude is naturally 6'4", just naturally towering almost everybody else in the cast. And I see that coming a little more natural here in the Fondjoy than I am in the McFarlane toys, now looking at them right next to each other. Like I said, it's one of those optical illusion sort of situations for a collector where if you see a figure individually, you think to yourself, well, it's not that bad. But once you put them right next to each other, the way that the width of the McFarlane looks a bit flat in comparison to the much more natural sculpt work of the torso for the Fondjoy, as well as the way that the legs and the arms are tooled naturally to that torso piece that just feels much more fluid, much more organic. Whereas the McFarlane, again, I understand you're going for something that's just basic retail, but it is still nonetheless the theatrical deluxe edition. So even though you're having to jump through a couple of more overseas logistical hurdles with the Fondjoy, those hurdles are ultimately yielding the result of much better proportions, specifically with the way that, like I said, everything's tooled as far as the thigh pieces. But to me, what really makes me kind of illustrate the very stark differences is that chest piece. If you look at how flat the chest looks on the McFarlane and how wide the shoulders look in a much more unnatural way versus that of the Fondjoy. And that combined with the texture work that they were able to line up just a little bit better. Again, some of the linings that kind of make up the alien nature of the suit feel just a little bit 3D printed in terms of actual texture to skin feel when kind of grazing your fingers across them on the Fondjoy, but at least they look like they're directly lifted from the suit as opposed to that of the McFarlane. Even though if you kind of compare them and kind of shift your eyes from one to the next, you'll notice that some of the linings are more or less accurate to one another. They just stretch the dimensions to sort of match the scaling of the figure. So here they're going to be a bit more shrunken down because you're dealing with a 7-inch versus the 8.5, almost 9-inch over here. But in terms of orientation, where they're placed, the actual shapings of some of those linings, like the ones that you see here on the side of the thighs, the front of the knee pad right there, or the ones here on the side of the obliques, they're pretty much one-to-one. There's almost nothing that's overhauled or changed. In fact, probably the biggest change that I think is a little more accurate on the Fondjoy, and it kind of begs the question as to why it is that they opted to do this on the McFarlane, is that they painted, if you look at the back, they painted a certain like pad or buckle from the underpants red as opposed to the yellow, but it turns out that it's supposed to be yellow. So many different looks from behind the suit, as well as like an in-depth behind the scenes look at the costume from Outfitters where they were doing some of the behind the scenes stuff, shows that that buckle on the back is supposed to just be yellow along with the rest of the belt, not red. So this time Fondjoy was actually able to get that pretty accurate. It's such a nonchalant detail that's covered up by the cape, which are both sported via felt goods and also happen to be incorporated with the wiring. But again, speaking much more to some of the natural elements of the Fondjoy, it's stitched into the collar area and to the shoulder pieces and kind of implanted in there much more naturally than that of the McFarlane. With the McFarlane, it just kind of looks like they were struggling to fit the wire into those nice little slits right on the side of the collar there. Now, the wiring is a bit more favorable on the McFarlane. It feels a bit more rigid, more tangible, and much more better quality. But at least both are able to retain the form of whatever sort of position you put them in. Practically about the same. But one win that the McFarlane was able to secure is that yellow symbol on the back. As noted before, yeah, this reminded me that the yellow symbol on McFarlane was expertly nailed by having an actual screen print on the cape itself, as opposed to simply just doing the whole dye sublimation, painting it or jetting it into the actual fabric to make it kind of look like a JPEG over on the Fondjoy. Ultimately disappointed, and looking at them much more closely, it does look like the cape on the Fondjoy is much more screen accurate, but the only really garish blemish, yes, I used wordplay there, I'm sorry, is that yellow symbol. It's so perfect. The cape is almost borderline right there, but if it wasn't for the yellow symbol, if we were to have been able to take the method of applying this yellow symbol that they did on the McFarlane over here on the Fondjoy, chef's kiss of a cape in the scale, and they would have nailed it aces. But hey, that's at least for a detail that's going to be on the back and not necessarily facing us head on. You know what is facing us? The head sculpt, and this is arguably another win for Fondjoy. Yeah, seeing at them directly, you can see how much more of a natural skin tone and plastic and everything that they were able to utilize to sculpt out the head for the Corn Sweat Superman, at least at the last second, because like I said, I was very, very worried when I saw those initial promo photos. It's almost like they were able to take that 3-point shot right at the buzzer and swoosh. But they were quite literally 3 points behind, or rather 2 points behind, rather. And they were able to not only hit the 3 points to pass the tie and also win the game. Just barely there, just barely, just by 1 point. And that's ultimately what Fondjoy was able to do with the head sculpt. Again, McFarlane was able to retain the little curl on the hair, but at least you got much more natural skin tones, sculpt work. Credit where credit is due, McFarlane was able to hone in on like the little dimples and the shaping of the face and making sure that the likeness is as close to Corn Sweat as possible. And if anything, I would say that I like the paint application for the eyes as far as giving it that breath of life behind them, because as I mentioned before, the pupils on the Fondjoy are a little bit too narrow to make them look a little dead-eye and almost kind of creepy. However, with the McFarlane, I can kind of see that the actual orientation of the eyes is just a little off. They often have this problem with certain real live action caricatures of people from their movies into McFarlane Toys form, where the eyes, there's always one eye that's just maybe a little aloof or something, just a tiny bit lazy, and you can see that coming through just a little with the Corn Sweat Superman and even in the deluxe theatrical edition. But the one other thing that the head sculpts really reminded me of, and why it is that I prefer the Fondjoy, is that it's something that ultimately I started to resonate with as I handled not just the head sculpt, not just the head joints, but also the rest of the body, is that the predominance of the figure is made out of plastic that's actually sculpted and molded and comes out in that natural color scheming. Whereas with the McFarlane, especially with the head joint, I get often reminded over the fact that an awful lot of these paint applications to give it that skin tone are simply just that, paint applications. Right underneath, we probably have a different form of plastic that's completely colored in a completely different shade of something else, and they have to overpaint it with the skin tone, and in doing so, it causes this really ugly feeling towards the articulation whenever moving any of the joints about that just feels overly rigid, almost kind of brittle. I get kind of scared to move that head joint around or do anything with it, as opposed to the Fondjoy where everything feels much more smoother, a little tighter, but at least it feels smooth. Everything feels like it's glazing upon itself in terms of the joints, the way that the elbows sort of are jointed together, the knees, etc. The McFarlane, sometimes I still feel like there's conflicting notions to the articulation that we really shouldn't be feeling in 2025. Thus making the Fondjoy a bit more preferable when it comes to posing and certain stances, and also messing around with the extra hands, which is also the other thing that the McFarlane comes with, on top of a couple of other little bonuses inside of the theatrical deluxe edition when it comes to these much more character-specific, smaller assortment of accessories. And this is another win for the Fondjoy because you got much better allocation of those hand accessories to help out some of those poses in terms of giving us symmetrical hands. 2 fists, two semi-gripping, two flight hands, despite the very strange orientation of the thumbs. Whereas with McFarlane, similar to the standard edition, the singular release, you get two flight hands with the thumbs kind of off to the side, but then you only got one fist for the right and then one gripping for the left. Nothing in between. Again, I still stand by what I said, especially for the theatrical deluxe edition. I feel like with the extra money that we're spending, there should be an extra fist and extra gripping. I'm sorry. But if there's one thing that the McFarlane was able to remind me of, is that inside of the theatrical deluxe edition, you do get three extra faceplates. Again, a couple of them are a little on the marginal side as far as expressions. In fact, the one that he's got technically on here is the confident face, which is the one that I had to swap out for the default one, which is this kind of like smiling, sort of happy, raised eyebrows. As I mentioned in that review, this is the look that he gives Lois. This is the look that he gives the citizens of Metropolis when he's trying to be confident and heroic. And then he's got a much more aggressive, semi-angryish face that he probably gives Lex Luthor or any of his enemies. And then we got a faceplate that kind of reminded me of a very missed opportunity that Fondjoy could have taken huge advantage of, which is the laser face. And the reason why I say this is because now thinking about it, Fondjoy would have killed it if they had included a laser head sculpt. Something that the more I thought about, the more I started to concoct a bit of a tinfoil hat theory that maybe that's the reason for why the joint on the top of the neck feels a little loose, is that maybe the intention was to have the head be removable so that you can swap it for a laser head sculpt. But that's just a theory. There's no proof or any kind of indication of the sort that could point to this. Again, tinfoil hat conspiracy that I kind of concocted, but it definitely would have benefited the overall package of not just the deluxe edition, but also the standard edition, should that have been an inclusion. And since we are dealing with the deluxe editions of either respective Superman, they both come included with their own little cryptos. And we have to dedicate a whole segment to comparing the crypto figurines here. And as I noted before, I still wish that we could have gotten quality over quantity in regards to the Fondjoy choice or method that they opted in for the cryptos by giving us both a flight version and a neutral version. And that's all well and good in terms of having this different orientation and sculpture of the body, but I really would have preferred articulation. Yeah, I like it that it's got an articulated mouth, and even the McFarlane was not able to do that. And the paint applications and the sculpt work for the fur is really, really nice, as well as being able to, like I mentioned before, having the cape be in a flight position for this one, kind of blowing in the wind, as opposed to the draping one and the neutral one. But if you look a little carefully, something else that just kind of floored me when I first pulled them out of the box for this recent comparison, and then putting them right next to each other, there's a whole lot more life and personality and almost, I dare say, charisma behind the McFarlane eyes than the Fondjoys. The Fondjoy, like I said, I'm freaked out by that dog. I don't know if I should probably like call the vets or my neighbor or police. I don't know. I'm scared of the Fondjoy crypto, whereas the McFarlane legitimately feels like a good boy that I'm willing to play fetch with. And considering that his is not able to take flight and it doesn't look as... He's almost kind of going for like a pose that's in between these two. So he's not full on flight like this, but he's also not super stoic and neutral as this guy is. He's kind of like a nice little ready boy in between, like he's ready to, like I said, play fetch and ready to take off. And he does come with the felt good cape. Granted, it's not going to look as sleek as some of the Fondjoy's ones, but at least it's a felt good. It kind of amplifies a little bit of the quality for the little figurine. And it's also able to sort of mask a few of the paint applications that I had the problem with for the McFarlane. Like I said, they made him look a little mangy with a little yellow tint to make him look a little dirty, or maybe kind of cast sort of this shadow on him. Didn't really work out that well, but at least they were able to saturate a little bit more color on the collar for the little symbol there on the front, the little spikes. And again, that head, sure, it's able to retain the ears, but at least it's got much better livelihood behind the little dots of the eyes as opposed to what's happening over here. So much like with our actual Man of Steel, it looks like companies are still struggling to nail their cryptos. And when it comes to like the higher, bigger, premium quality figures in the 1/6 scale like Hot Toys and InArt, even they're struggling. Some of their little crypto figurines don't look all that lifelike. They look like blown out versions of what you see before you hear. But at least within this scale and this price allocation, I would say that it's another major trade-off situation where you get the different poses and quantity for the Fondjoy, including this little base right here, as well as the open mounts. But at least in terms of something that doesn't look like it's going to kill you in your sleep, you got the McFarlane. So it's pretty clear that neither company has nailed the ultimate formula of delivering the perfect Superman from the David Cornsweet James Gunn film. At least within this affordable market, we'll see exactly what some of the prosumers bring about as far as Mafex. Maybe we'll get some other company in terms of like 3.0, or maybe LPZZ will tackle this live action interpretation of the character. And then of course, if you're willing to spend somewhere in the hundreds, mid to somewhat low range hundreds, somewhere between 3 to 5, maybe even $600, of course, you're dealing with the Hot Toys and the in-art. Notice how in that paragraph, I never noticed HH Figure Arts because unless they change that goddamn head sculpt, they're not even in the discussion. I'm sorry, I don't even want to hear it. On top of that, the color scheming is very Superman Returns with the maroon red. It's completely off and inaccurate. He's not invited to the cookout, all right? He's not. Regarding these two direct competitors of what's available right now, what is much more tangible and realistic for a collector to consider should they have really fallen in love with this version of the character, want their own little crypto figurine, there is a little bit of give and take with either characters, and I know that one is a bit more readily available to the extent of being able to go to your nearest Walmart and grabbing him off the peg and walking out, but at that price range, because sometimes it's easy to sort of forget about the prices at the convenience of being able to just drive to that brick and mortar store. But if you are willing to jump through some of those hurdles, one rather major one that has recently been implemented with the whole tariff situation, I would say that the Fondjoy is frankly one of their best releases as far as really great value for even the standard edition with much better hand assortment. The plastic, the way the tooling of the articulation feels really good in hand. Posing and actually making him look like he's in flight combined with the base, it actually feels fun to play around with, and having the head sculpt be refined from its initial release photos, as well as also being able to incorporate some rather realistic skin tones that feels like a really good addition to the shelf presence that you're kind of developing for the James Gunn Superman, or at least a brand new iteration of the DCU. This guy is gonna most definitely feel really great at home there. Taking just the standard core figures into account, Fondjoy is able to inch over the McFarlane with a couple of notches above, but still manages to stay within that same league. And therefore, I'm going to give it a very high and enthusiastic 8 out of 10. I know if you go back and watch my review or / comparison of the Cornsweet McFarlane figures, you'll note that in that video, I gave the theatrical deluxe edition also an 8 out of 10. But if I was to still be going with like decimal points, it's a bit arbitrary, but I'll just use it here as an example. I'd say the McFarlane is like an 8.0 flat or 8.1 at best, whereas the Fondjoy is like an 8.8, 8.9, and probably would have delved into the 9.0 territory should it have been, if we're strictly talking about the standard edition and you're just getting the core figure, that yellow symbol on the back. I'm sorry. If they had implemented it the way that McFarlane did, it would have been a 9 out of 10. But don't get it twisted. Despite coming up short of that specific rating, I would still argue that this Cornsweet Superman from Fondjoy is probably one of their finer releases in the past year or so, and probably one of their best releases for 2025 thus far. And if you've been on the fence as to which one you should pick up here, though you'd get the convenience method of getting this guy to the point where you could practically have him by either tomorrow or in a couple of days. He's much more readily available now than he was a few months back, but I still have to kind of throw my hat in the ring for the Fondjoy Superman. And if you guys are in the market for picking him up, the link for the Kalki site, as I mentioned before, is going to be available in the description as well as in the pinned comment. I will link it directly to the product page as well as the overall website where you guys can check out not just other Fondjoy figures for either the Zack Snyder Batman universe or even the Lex Luthor from the Cornsweet movie that's also, I think, readily available in stock, as well as a couple of other pre-orders that have gone up recently, such as the LPZZ Deathstroke or the HH Figure Arts Ben Reilly Spider-Man from Across the Spider-Verse, and many other. I think they even have the in-art Cornsweet Superman available for pre-order. So if you guys want to check that out, like I mentioned before, links are going to be in the description as well as in the pinned comment. Greatly appreciate it if you guys look out for those. But I also appreciate and have to thank Kalkis for sending this figure on for review. Otherwise, guys, if you enjoyed this review and comparison, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed it, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, take care and stay humble.